Good afternoon and welcome to the Housing and Economic Development Committee. The date is April 28th and we will begin with roll call, posting of the agenda, and the flag salute.
Member Basua.
Here.
Member Flynn.
Here.
Chair Madrigal.
Here.
Chair, we have a quorum, and the agenda for this meeting was posted in the City Hall kiosk on Wednesday, April 22nd.
Okay, thank you very much. Mayor Flynn, can you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
All rise, please. Place your right hand over your heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which we stand, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you very much, Mayor. Moving on to public comments on items not on the agenda. And it looks like we do not have any public comments, right?
Correct.
All right, moving on. Part C, the consent agenda. The approval of minutes for the April 14th, 2020 meeting.
Move the recommended action.
Second.
Call for a vote.
Member Basua.
Aye.
Member Flynn.
Aye.
Chair Madrigal.
Aye.
The motion to approve carries 3-0.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to item D, reports. Our first report is the development impact fee for affordable housing in-lieu fee and inclusionary housing ordinance amendments.
Did you bring it up, Michelle? Yeah, no worries. Good afternoon, committee members. I'm Kathleen Mallory. I'm the Planning and Sustainability Manager, and I'll be providing some quick overview, introductory comments, and then turning the presentation over to Hida Mosesman, who will be giving the presentation. She's with Harris Associates. So I just wanted to first start and provide context. This was definitely a group effort led by the executive committee.
Just a moment. I think there's a little bit of an echo. If you could turn off any other speakers that you may have. Thank you.
So just proceeding, just to thank the group that was involved in this efforts, from members of the Housing Department, Emilio Elsa Brown, as well as Darwin Bass, who was the executive committee chair, helping to move this work effort along. The city, as their inclusionary ordinance was last updated in 2006, and the purpose of it is to generate affordable housing and increase market rate as well as affordable units within the city. It's common practice to impose the in-lieu affordable housing fee. As part of the staff report, the city also received input on the fee study and methodology from different members of the community. In addition to the staff report before you this evening, staff distributed a memo dated April 24th, which summarized comments that we received from other members of the Affordable Housing Advocacy Group, and that is included in your packet and should be made as part of the record. In addition to the comments from members of the Affordable Housing Advocacy Group is staff's response to those comments that were made. This memo also recommends amending recommendation number 3 within your packet, and that is for this committee to recommend to City Council that the inclusionary housing ordinance be updated simultaneously with updating of the housing element. There were also a few other comment letters that should be entered into the record and make comments regarding the increase in the affordable housing in lieu fee before you today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Hida Mosesman with Harris & Associates, who will be giving the bulk of the presentation. I'll be advancing the slides for you, Hida, and as well as we have members of our committee and our community here, Community Development Housing, that can answer other questions that you may have.
Thanks, Kathleen. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Hida Mosesman. I'm a Senior Director for Community Economics and Housing Solutions with Harris. and I'm joining you today to present the Affordable Housing in Lieu Fee Nexus study that we recently prepared. Great, thank you. Just a general overview of the topics that we're going to cover in the presentation. We're going to give some background and some information on the current affordable housing need at the local level. We're going to take a look at your existing inclusionary housing ordinance and in lieu fees. We will cover our study methodology and walk you through that in detail. We'll present the findings from our study and the proposed fees contained in the study. And then I'd be happy, Allison Boulay and I, also Senior Director with Harrison Associates, would be happy to answer any of your questions. So by way of background, we felt it was important to present sort of the current situation that you have locally in terms of the affordable housing need. We looked at the median annual income of an average Oxnard household, and that's about $68,000 a year. Then we also looked at what the costs were to rent or purchase an apartment or home. On the rental side, the average rent, including utilities, is about $2,200 a month. Using HUD guidelines, looking at housing costs being on the rental side no more than 35% of your monthly income, we work backwards with the math and determine that the income needed to rent this market rate unit would be about $7,400 a month. However, with the median annual household income at $68,000, that median monthly income would then be about $5,700 a month. So you've got a difference of about $1,700 on what the average household can afford versus what it costs to rent. On the purchase side, we found that the average home price, this is condominiums and single family, is about $662,000. So in terms of the annual income needed to pay a mortgage, property taxes, homeowners association fees, maintenance, other things, we backed into an annual income needed about $171,000 a year. The monthly on that would be about $14,000 a month. However, we're looking at an average annual household income in Oxnard of $68,000. So the delta there is about $8,600. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of disparity between what an average household can afford to pay and what the market dictates at the current rate. I also wanted to highlight the fact that the affordability crisis in terms of housing is pretty well documented. It's a statewide problem rather than just a local problem for cities. And a lot of times I've heard the question, well, why isn't more affordable housing built to cover this need? And the short answer to that is that it costs more to build with land costs and construction costs than the revenue that's derived either at the sale or the rental of the unit. And it requires some type of public subsidy or public funding source to fill the gap. And so that's why we find ourselves in a state where we don't have as much affordable housing as we need. So again, we have a very well-documented affordable housing crisis statewide. Many cities, including Oxnard, have adopted an inclusionary housing ordinance, which amends your municipal code to require a certain percentage of units be set aside as affordable when market rate development occurs. This is, again, it's common practice to allow for, instead of having those units part of a development, for cities to allow developers to pay a fee instead of providing the units, aptly termed an in-lieu fee, or to allow developers to build the affordable inclusionary units off-site outside of that project. And this is done to provide options to developers and some flexibility so that those developers don't choose to build housing in an adjacent community that maybe doesn't have an inclusionary housing requirement or extra fee. So looking at the city again has an existing inclusionary housing ordinance, last amended in 2006. On the for sale side, your ordinance requires that 10% of all market rate for sale units be set aside for and be affordable to lower income households. And that basically means households that earn 80% or below of the median. And on the rental side, it's similarly a 10% requirement, but it's split up between 5% for very low income households, making 50% of median and below, and 5% for low income households, again at the 80% of median or below. Your ordinance also requires that there be 20-year covenants to preserve the affordability. And all covenants mean is that there is a requirement recorded on the property restricting the units as affordable for a 20-year time period. So in line with your existing inclusionary housing ordinance, you also allow developers to pay a fee to provide that flexibility that I had talked about. And for ownership units, that fee would be 1% of the sales price of each market rate unit. And that would be a minimum of $5,000 per unit. On the rental side, it would the current fee is $7,700 roughly. So that means if a developer came in with a 100-unit rental project market rate project they wanted to build, they would have to pay about $770,000 in inclusionary housing fees if they did not make 10% of those units affordable to very low and low income residents. I also wanted to point out that in looking at other cities that have inclusionary housing ordinances, Oxnard the percentages at the very low and low income levels are in line or exceed the levels of affordability of other cities in the area, as other cities allow for workforce and moderate income units to be part of their inclusionary housing ordinance. One other comment I wanted to make on the fees, I'm sorry, if we could go back to the previous slide. Thank you. So these fees have been paid over the past 14 years, I guess, since the last time you amended your ordinance. Based on my discussions with staff, staff has been successful in leveraging the fees collected and pairing those fees with state and federal funding sources such as low-income housing tax credits and other funding sources to build a large number of affordable, or to facilitate the large number of affordable units. So the good news is there are, California, especially with the low-income housing tax credits, there is a good funding source available so that these fees can be leveraged to create units in having sort of a capital stack and combining different funding sources. So looking at the IN-LIEU Nexus study that Harris prepared, we approached the study using two different methodologies. The first methodology we're calling the inclusionary equivalent. So basically that looks at your existing percentages that we went over in a previous slide, roughly 10% requirement, inclusionary housing requirement for rental and for sale development at very low and low income households. We generally use those same percentages. However, we updated construction costs, rents, and different affordability metrics with your existing percentages. The second methodology we looked at, which is more of the nexus study, is we looked at what the demand for affordable units is that results from the development of market rate units. So basically, when market rate units are developed, it generates, and I'll go over that on a slide as part of this presentation, to draw the parallel between the development of market rate units and that creating a demand also for affordable units. I did want to emphasize that the common data point for both scenarios is we looked at something called the affordability gap, and I apologize, my dog's growling in the background. We looked at something called the affordability gap, and that basically is the difference between what it costs to build a project, market rate project, and then what households at different income levels can afford to pay for those units. So that is the common factor in either scenario. So this slide really illustrates and provides a step-by-step description of the methodology that we used on what we call the inclusionary equivalent, that really looks at your existing inclusionary housing requirements, those percentages of very low and low income units that have to be part of any new development. So we start by looking at the type of the new market rate units that are being developed in Oxnard in terms of single family for sale, multifamily for sale, and then rental. And then we looked at, we collected information and analyzed the cost to build these types of projects, both for sale and rental. And then we looked at the household incomes at various affordability levels, very low, low, and moderate. And we calculated using those household incomes and the percentages, 30 to 35% of annual income or monthly income, to calculate what the maximum would be that each of those levels of affordability would be able to spend on housing per year, month and per year. And so we calculated the gap, the affordability gap that I referred to previously. For sale, that's the cost to build the market rate for sale units minus the sales price that would be affordable to various income levels, very low, low, and moderate. And then on the rental side, we calculated the gap by looking at the cost to build a rental project minus the amount of revenue, the maximum amount of revenue that would support debt, basically the long-term permanent construction loan that would have to be obtained by the developer. And so the fee is based on the affordability gap, both at the for sale and the rental, which are different numbers, times your existing inclusionary housing requirement in your existing ordinance. So this table looks more at the numbers. So we just went over the methodology, and this would be the numbers. So walking you through this table, starting with the left-hand side, we have our different unit types, single family and multifamily. And this is the for sale scenario. So this is only looking at condominiums and single family units. Then we show income levels at low and moderate. Now, the reason we didn't include very low here is because of the lending requirements that became much more strict and challenging after the 2009 recession and the Dodd-Frank legislation that was passed on a federal level. It is very difficult, even at the maximum mortgages at these affordability levels, for that very low category of buyers to obtain a loan to purchase at that level of affordability. So just from a feasibility standpoint, we looked at low and moderate in terms of our analysis. So again, we looked at the maximum mortgage based on the household incomes at these different levels of affordability, and looking at the percentage, 30 to 35% of that maximum income, what is the maximum amount of a mortgage that these households could afford? And those are the numbers you see there in the max mortgage column. We then compare the maximum amount that these households would be able to pay versus the cost to develop these units. And then, so our affordability gap, which is basically the development costs less the maximum mortgage costs at these different levels of affordability. So again, these the affordability gap on this slide, it's the for sale number. The affordability gap is the same whether we're looking at the inclusionary equivalent based on your existing inclusionary housing ordinance or the demand base that we will review on a couple of more slides. So here is the way we calculated the affordability gap on the rental, and hopefully I'm not going into too much detail here. I just kind of wanted to walk you through the numbers and the way that we sort of came up with these numbers. So again, looking at different levels of affordability, very low is included as part of this because the financial feasibility is not an issue because there is no mortgage or loan that has to be obtained. So we have very low, low, and moderate. We look at the maximum amount of income that's available for rent, again, determined by the different levels of income at different affordability levels, times those percentages of what the maximum amount should be spent for housing costs per month. And then we look at the annual gross rental income that would be derived. So it's basically the row number one times 12 for 12 months. Then we estimated and obtained information on annual expenses that would need to be paid for, assuming a 5% vacancy rate as part of this rental project, this hypothetical rental project, and then maintenance costs. And that leaves us, if you subtract 2 from 3, line 2 from 3, with the net operating income at different levels of affordability. And then looking at that net operating income, that's what would be used to obtain a loan. Loans are typically given looking at net operating income, but needing for there to be extra debt service coverage, meaning there needs to be more income than your maximum loan payment. So really the amount that would be available for the debt service in terms of what could go towards a loan would be less. So we applied 125% debt service coverage ratio because that's what lenders are requiring these days. So that nets us with the supportable debt at each of the income levels, assuming a loan at 6% interest. This would be the developer getting the loan at a 30-year term. That's the maximum supportable debt. And then comparing that to the development costs per unit, which is, those costs are the same regardless of the income level. They're not dependent on the level of income. And then that gets us to the final line 8, which is the affordability gap, the development costs minus the maximum supportable debt. So what we did from here is we took that affordability gap and we wanted to calculate an average, both for sale and for rent at different levels of affordability. So you can see the very first column, households generated per market rate unit development. We have different levels of affordability here. On the for sale side, we have single family and multifamily condos and homes. And then on the rental side, we have the multifamily units. And these are numbers derived from the previous slides. This is the affordability gap that we calculated. So across different unit types, so for very low, you'll see that there's an NA under single family and an NA under multifamily. That's due to the financial feasibility issue that I described earlier with difficulties obtaining loans at certain levels of affordability, income levels. So really the average affordability gap for very low income is based on the for rent affordability gap that we calculated there. Whereas for low and moderate income, we did look at the different unit types because we had a calculation and we basically averaged those out. These are the average affordability gaps per level of income across all unit types. So the second type of scenario that we looked at in our study is that demand-based that I had referred to. And as I walk you through, you'll see sort of the meaning of demand-based. So again, we looked at the type of new market rate units that are being developed in Oxnard. We looked at the sales prices and the rents. And then we looked at what the gross household income that would be necessary to rent or buy one of these market rate units would be. From there, we calculated what the discretionary household income would be for those new residents of the new market rate units, what they would spend on goods and services in the community. And then we use the in-plan model, which is really the gold standard of economic modeling. You take income or spending and you plug that into the model that's specific for by county. So this would be for Ventura County. And that in-plan model then sort of spits out the amount of jobs that would be generated by that spending, and also provides the demand for household units as well. So using that information from the previous slides that I referred to, the affordability gap for sale, again, it's the same for this scenario as it is for the inclusionary scenario as well. It's the cost to build the unit minus the sales price that different levels of income, very low, low, and moderate, can afford to pay. And we have a similar calculation for the affordability gap for rental, the cost to build minus the maximum supportable debt that the developer has available to pay back the loan. And we take that gap and we multiply it times the unit demand that's underlined from the fourth box there. That's from the in-plan model. And that is how we calculated the demand-based scenario. So looking at this table, this is basically what the in-plan model told us the demand for units was, resulting from market rate development. And I just wanted to explain here, if you think about market rate units being developed and you think about the families, the households that move into those units, they purchase goods and services in the community. So they're supporting businesses, new businesses open, or existing businesses are hiring new employees. Either way, there are new jobs created by that spending on goods and services. And then we look at the income levels of the employees who are working to provide those goods and services, and looking at what those employees can afford to spend on housing. And then we were able to calculate, using the in-plan information, the demand, the amount of units that is the demand generated by those new market rate units. And these are sort of the numbers, and these are obviously fractions of numbers. But overall, we looked at different income levels, very low, low, moderate, and then over 120% of AMI, or area median income. That's what AMI stands for. Over 120% of area median income is above moderate, so like workforce housing. And we calculated that market rate development creates a demand for every unit. We have a 0.527 demand for single family units, 0.392 for multifamily, and 0.296 for rental multifamily. So these are the numbers that we were able to calculate using the in-plan information in terms of the demand. So this table summarizes the findings in the study that you have before you. Looking at the different land uses or unit types, we have single family, multifamily for sale, multifamily for rent. looking at the inclusionary requirement, your existing inclusionary requirement. So this table really does focus on the inclusionary equivalent. I wanted to clarify that. Being consistent with your existing ordinance, we wanted to show those numbers as sort of a starting point to look at what your proposed fees could be. So looking at your existing inclusionary requirement per your existing ordinance, that's the second column there. And then affordability levels, or AMI, area median income. So that would be the percentage. So if it says up to 80%, that's area median income. That represents low or lower income households. 50 to 80% on the multifamily rent. That also represents low income households. And then up to the 50%, that would be very low income households. So looking at the different levels of affordability, we have our affordability gap per unit that we calculated pursuant to the previous slides that we just covered. So basically we take your inclusionary requirement percentage, multiply that times the affordability gap, which gets us those fees anywhere from $11,000 to $44,000, depending on the unit type. And then we calculate a total fee per unit. Now you'll see, and I wanted to clarify, that for single family development, the total fee per unit is $44,700, multifamily $36,800 roughly. It's the same under fee per unit and total fee per unit. The reason we added this extra column is that your inclusionary housing ordinance calls for not a straight 10% across the board for rental units. It splits it up between 5% for low and 5% for very low. So we calculated the fee per unit at different affordability levels and then added them together to get the total fee per multifamily rental unit developed. Then we looked at the average fee in other surrounding cities based on available information that we were able to obtain. And as you can see, that we did an average of all of those cities. So, similar in some ways, especially on the multifamily for sale, but a little bit lower on the single family development and the multifamily rent. And using, looking at the total fees per unit through this inclusionary equivalent methodology, and then comparing that to the average fees of other cities, came up with a proposed fee that's a little more rounded in order to remain competitive with what surrounding communities are collecting, and also keeping in mind that these inclusionary housing fees can be very successfully leveraged with other public funding sources to create a good amount of affordable units in the community. So in terms of next steps, these are sort of the dates that we were looking at in terms of city actions. So it's been scheduled, I think, for May 19th that the City Council will be taking the study and having a first public hearing. On June 2nd, it's estimated that second reading of the ordinances would occur. Fees would be effective 60 days after final City Council action. And it is the plan of the city, based on our discussions with staff, to update, sort of revamp the existing inclusionary housing as part of your general plan update. And I think that concludes the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I believe we do have one speaker, public speaker, and that would be Barbara Macrio Ortiz, I believe, Michelle, if I'm not mistaken.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi.
Hi. So it's Michelle, the city clerk from the Housing and Economic Development Committee meeting. And you'll have 3 minutes to make your comments.
Okay, I'm not sure how this is going to work. Welcome, everybody, to our new world. And I have several concerns with this. I trust that people got my comment letter and had a chance to go over it. I wish you would have gone through your comments first so I could have responded to any questions that people had. Primarily, I think that it needs to be clear. I understand that the staff is making a recommendation, but the language is basically the same. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page, that the commitment is that they will update the inclusionary ordinance at a time to where the new ordinance would be adopted at the same time or before you adopt your housing element, rather than sticking it in as a program that can happen in the next 7 years. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of this fee, the gap for very low income cannot be less than the gap for low income on these multifamily. The way it was explained to me, the way they got the figure lower was they said, oh, if you're building rental, you can do it at 39 units to the acre, and with a for sale, it would be 30 units to the acre, and that's just a myth because our land use policies are the same throughout. And actually, it's harder to get the higher densities in, particularly in the AHOP, because those are at 24. You might get to 30 with the density bonus. So I think that's a mistake, and you should use the same figure for the very low as you're using for the rental as you're using for the multifamily for sale. It's time for you to use your police powers. The whole discussion about this nexus and the demand, that all went out the door when the Supreme Court ruled on the BIA case. You use your police powers because you need to address the affordable housing crisis that we have. And I think it's important to understand that right now the ordinance requires the 15% in redevelopment project areas, and they're taking that out. So you're even lowering the amount of affordable housing that you should be requiring under the existing ordinance. So I would say don't take that out. The law never changed. The agency, the redevelopment agency may have gone away, but not the law with respect to that project base. And I see I'm just about running out of time here, so I would just say that our goal really needs to be creating more housing. We built over 13,000 units. We built more than any other jurisdiction, and our overcrowding is worse than any other jurisdiction. So I think that idea of, the more you build, the better it gets, just isn't true. It hasn't happened in Oxnard. So we need to start addressing housing for our own people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Moving on, we will move on to the committee member comments. Mayor, the floor is yours. Mayor, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Could we, I pride myself in not muting myself, but anyway, I did that time. Could we go to the summary of the fees? It's just like 1 or 2 pages before this. I had a couple quick questions. There we go. So what's interesting is, for the single family, it's the fee or unit is $44,000, but the proposed fee goes to $36,000. So is that, in essence, as I understand it, I asked Ms. Mosesman if that is then the $36,000 proposed fee is basically first us using a methodology to come to this fee per unit, total fee per unit. But then when you're looking at the average of other cities, then that's how we've arranged the proposed fee. Is that in essence what that is?
Yeah, I think we tried to be more in line with the cities that surround you. The city does not have to adopt so the fees that are contained in here are what's called the maximum fees, maximum supportable, sort of like maximum supportable debt. So that's what these represent. Cities do have the latitude to select a fee that is not the maximum fee. There's no requirement that you do that. Based on my understanding, and I'll just say right now, I'm not an attorney, but based on the other studies that I've done with other cities and the attorneys that I've talked to, that Barbara is correct. There isn't a strict legal requirement to do a nexus study on the rental. There is still a requirement to do a nexus on the for sale.
I see.
And so, and with the nexus study on the for sale, the law gives us guidance on that. And so that $44,000 that you're seeing is really the maximum fee you can charge.
I understand. And then the multiple family for sale, just below that is the proposed fee is very close to that. And then the same thing with the multiple family rent. That's also the fee, total fee per unit, and the proposed are also the same. So the only discrepancy where you're kind of going more away from the maximum fee, and it's more of a, I don't know how negligible the difference is. I mean, if we're talking about larger developments, and I don't know how many of those potentially this would be without looking at the general plan, the 2030 general plan, but it's about an $8,700 difference or something of that nature. So in essence, the proposal is in essence not to go with the maximum fee and then be more in line with other cities. That's really what it is. And I wanted to ask you about those other cities. What are those other cities? I'm just curious to know.
Sure, and we do list it in our study. I'm just looking at the list right now.
Okay.
We looked at San Luis Obispo County, Calabasas, Agora Hills, Santa Barbara, Oceanside, Pasadena, and Santa Monica. And I know some of those cities seem a little bit far away. It's not always very clear when cities do have inclusionary housing in lieu fees. And so we went with information that was publicly available, basically. We did learn after we did the study, and actually pretty recently, that both the city of San Luis Obispo and the city of Goleta also have inclusionary housing. I think Goleta just did theirs in January of this year.
Okay.
And so they also have fees. But I was going to say that the levels of affordability that you have in your ordinance are in line or exceed.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was my only question, really.
Mr. Chair, if you're trying to speak, I think you're on mute still.
Oh, I'm sorry then. I muted myself. My apologies. Councilwoman Basua.
Thank you. I hope I'm not on mute. I have a question in regards, do we know what the total amount of in-lieu fees are that we collect a year? Does anybody have a figure?
I would defer to staff probably on that answer. I don't know that we have accurate information on that.
Okay.
Councilman Basua, Emilio is going to address what we do know about the fund balance or what we collect.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. Emilio Ramirez, Housing Director. I don't have a number memorized, and for that matter, the collection is based on the development of market rate, so it's a little sporadic. What I can tell you is that the current balance in our in-lieu fee fund is approximately $2.3 million.
And Can you tell me what programs are being assisted with those in lieu fees? Are we using that money at this time?
We do use the funds. Those funds are used to, first of all, it pays a piece of the operating salaries for the affordable housing development team, and then it gets used for development of affordable housing. So right now, we are in the midst of considering several applications for affordable housing development, including downtown, and those applications are to that fund.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. It is very informative. Back to the mayor's question. I was looking at the other cities, and it's right on here, and it goes from Agora Hills and Calabasas, which I think are the closest ones to us, to Santa Barbara, and then it goes to Santa Monica and West Hollywood. Was there any information of any cities in Ventura County in this study at all?
So that's where we sort of ran into sort of a public information challenge when it came to that. We know that Ventura is currently in the process of looking at their fees. But other than that, we were not able to determine that any cities that are immediately surrounding you actually have an in-lieu fee.
Chair, this is Kathleen Mallory. Just responding further, we did look at other cities. We did reach out to their staff and inquire what the status was of their in lieu fee. A number of cities were in the process of updating it, and a few cities didn't have an in lieu fee at all. From our research back in early January, for example, the city of Ventura is in the process of looking at establishing a fee, and the city of Thousand Oaks does not have one at this time. So we did look comprehensively at what was happening within other cities in Ventura County, just to name a few, for example.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm just trying to, I understand everything that was said, trying to make sense of it, but it's just the number from, for a single family for sale home, from the existing 7,000 all the way to 36,000. It's just it's a huge increase, especially with what we're facing at the moment economically, and what we are going to face once the economy opens back up. So, that's something I'm trying to take into account. Maybe if this was done maybe a month or a month and a half earlier, 6 weeks ago, then, I think it would have been a completely different answer. But at the moment, I'm kind of having second thoughts about this.
Mr. Chair, this is Jeff Lambert. I just wanted to add a thought too. A little bit different than the other development fees is this is not really taking a fee that we collect today and apply and increasing it, because as the council knows, the only way that somebody can apply the ability to have an in lieu fee today is to come to the council early in their process and apply for a pre-application and get council's blessing that that's an option that the council is willing to support. The council in the last couple of years, because the fee has been so low, has declined allowing that to happen. So in reality, the developers today don't really have that option because it's not been supported by the council. And this also isn't an imposition of a fee. It's a fee that's an option for the applicant. They could choose to build the units and not pay the fee. So I think it needs to be thought of slightly different than some of the other impact fees that we're considering.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lambert. And lastly, some of the comments that were made by Ms. Macri-Ortiz, any answers to some of her thoughts or questions?
I can probably address a few of them. I took some notes when she was talking, and she had communicated some of these comments to us as well. In terms of the density difference, that she had mentioned that we looked at a different density for sale multifamily than for rental multifamily. And that's true. You know, I know that every city is getting ready to do their new housing element, and every city has much larger arena numbers than they had the last cycle. And so, you know, looking at this study and trying to predict what's going to happen, not basically what's happened in the past, we wanted to account for sufficient density so that when you're looking at your density for your new housing element, it's likely that some of it will change considering the numbers. So we really wanted to have that density be a more moving forward, future looking density as opposed to maybe what a developer proposed a year or two ago. So I can speak to that. I think I did mention that it's my understanding that it's still legally required to do a nexus for inclusionary housing fees for ownership units as opposed to rental. There was a court case and then a bill that was passed by the California State Legislature in 2017, coined the Palmer Fix, that loosened that requirement. But I still feel that it's best practices to show, you know, the relationship of the fee to the demand or the relationship to the fee to the costs in the community to build the housing. And then I guess on her comment on the, you know, and this is definitely the city's policy decision, having worked in redevelopment for so many years prior to dissolution, I know that many cities that did have inclusionary housing did put a higher percentage for their redevelopment areas, simply because you had your 20% tax increment set aside. So knowing that there was a large funding source that could be used inside of the redevelopment area, I saw that as sort of a common practice. However, with the elimination of redevelopment and the loss of that funding source, I think that it makes sense to sort of re-examine that percentage if that's something that the council wants to do. My experience is that the higher the percentage, the more funding source, and now that that's not there, you know, the feasibility has to be looked at as well in light of the redevelopment loss. And I don't believe there's a law in the California Health and Safety Code that dictates that you have to keep your percentage of inclusionary housing within your redevelopment area. I don't think that's a requirement. I think it's a policy decision. But I'm sure your city attorney could speak to that.
Hi, this is Ken Roselle. It is correct that with the dissolution of redevelopment on February 1st, 2012, the obligation for the 15% affordability went away with the demise of redevelopment. This is optional. It is not legally mandated.
And just to close up on some of the comments that Hida made as well as Ken, we just wanted to reaffirm with the new density bonus law that went into effect in January related to the AHOP, 100% affordable projects are entitled to a 80% density bonus. So we feel very confident that we will be able to achieve those densities referenced in the study. Additionally, our housing element does provide for a range of densities in different areas of the community. Finally, we will be looking comprehensively at all these issues as part of our housing element update. Many of the items that Barbara so thoughtfully gave us feedback on have to do with policy questions, and we are looking forward to jumping into those, bringing those before council. Our housing element we have started that update process. We'll be having robust community engagement, virtually and otherwise, over the summer and through the fall, and we'll bring the updated housing element to the City Council in July of 2021. And just as another point, the recommendation to the committee is that the committee provide recommendation to the City Council to concurrently update the inclusionary ordinance with the housing element update to address some of the concerns that Ms. Macri-Ortiz raised.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any other comments by any of the committee members? If there are no additional comments, is there a motion on the floor? Again, committee members, any other comments? Or do we have a motion?
I see the mayor is trying to speak, but it looks like
Yeah,
his
I think
sound isn't working.
the mayor went out.
Maybe, Mayor, if you try to, okay,
No,
looks like
he
he's
just
going to go
left.
out and come back in again.
Okay, I'll give it a minute. Mayor?
I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Okay, yes, we can.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I would like to ask Ms. Mosesman. It was a great presentation, and I'm pretty fascinated with the methodology. I'm sorry to ask this question, but one of the things Ms. Ortiz, Barbara Mack Ortiz, talked about is she talked about supply, and she talked about the fact that she has been of the opinion that the more supply there is, then it will yield more affordable housing. I think she said something in this regard, and that has not been the case. I mean, I'm kind of curious about that. You studied economics, so I'm curious to know what your perspective is on that. I mean, people raise these issues about supply and demand. I have some concerns about supply and demand. I have one last follow-up question after that. But, I mean, wouldn't one think that more affordable housing is going to be produced the more that there's a supply? And if we have an inclusionary housing ordinance, I mean, how does one answer that question?
That's a difficult question, and there are a lot of differing opinions. A lot of the state legislature members thinks that if we do, the more we build, the more affordable it'll become because it's simple supply and demand. The challenge I see with that is that, California is a very nice place to live. Lots of people want to live here, especially if you're, more coastal. The better the economy, what I haven't seen is even when you do increase the supply, even cities that have met, for example, their RENA numbers, their state mandated numbers, it's not like you see prices going down or stable very much. I think it's a regional, I think maybe more in the inland areas, that could be the case. I think that coastal communities are more challenged. So I do think that inclusionary housing requirements do assist with that. And what I really think is important to emphasize is the fact that even though these fees may not look like they could build a unit on their own, because the state has allowed the expansion of the low-income housing tax credits, and because there are other sources of funding, making affordable housing work now, as opposed to the days of redevelopment when you could kind of write a big check and cover it. Now it's more of putting a jigsaw puzzle together. There's some tax credits, there's some home funds, there's, some, maybe there's some veterans money, there's, maybe a land donation. So, but because that we do have the low-income housing tax credits for rental housing, you can take a little bit of subsidy and make it go a long way and create, hundreds of units of affordable housing. I really think the tax credit program is our strongest asset as a state. And I do think that by enforcing the inclusionary housing fee, you will be able to create more units in your community. It is a difficult problem.
Right. Well, I think that's it, Mr. Chair and committee member Basua. I think it was very important that question be addressed because I will say, for one, and I won't ask the question, I'll just simply state it, that not a question, but a statement, that I'm not altogether certain that in coastal communities, especially in Ventura County, where I think the housing prices are 7th most expensive in the nation, I'm not really sure whether supply can ever really truly meet demand, that the housing prices, which are in part where they are because of demand and where we live, that those prices aren't going to go down, that supply ultimately will not only not drive down the price, I mean, it seems to be an economic calamity to drive down prices, or a really severe recession like in 2008 to drive down prices. So this whole argument about supply and demand is oftentimes brought up in these affordable housing discussions. It was brought up by Ms. Macro-Ortiz, and I'd just like to make a statement, Mr. Chair and Committee Member Basua, that I'm not an economist. I taught economics, but I'm not an economist here like Ms. Mosesman is here, and I just really question whether we can ultimately ever truly meet demand, and that in that context, it's not going to impact the affordability issue. And so the only thing that's going to affect affordability is the inclusionary housing ordinance, and as Ms. Mosesman said, these various funding mechanisms that are going to meet that demand. So that's always a question I've wanted answered, and at least you're one person that attempted to address it. So thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor. Do we have a motion on the floor?
Move the recommended action.
Mayor, just want to, and committee members, just a reminder, this is a move the recommended action with the amendment to recommendation number 3.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Second, no second, I guess I'll second.
Okay.
Okay.
Call for vote.
Member Basua?
Aye.
Member Flynn?
Aye.
Chair Madrigal?
Aye.
The motion carries 3-0.
Thank you very much. Moving on, we have a second item. Second item is the award of a contract for the kitchen rehabilitation project at Palm Vista. So presenting, we have Emilio Ramirez.
Good afternoon, members of the committee, council members, Mayor. Emilio Ramirez, Housing Director. This is the first time that I've been before the Housing Economic Committee. Proud to start this new effort. This item before you is really part of the Housing Authority operations and an expenditure and use of its capital fund for the improvement of public housing sites. In particular, this one, Palm Vista, located at 801 South C Street. It's a senior housing, public housing site. The capital fund, which is a special fund that we receive, grant funds that we receive from HUD for the purposes of improving public housing sites, is going to, or proposed to be used to rehabilitate 89 kitchens out of the 100-unit apartment complex that is located at that is known as Palm Vista. The scope of those improvements include replacement of kitchen cabinets, sinks, faucets, range hoods, essentially a complete remodel of the subject kitchens within Palm Vista. We are proposing to use a product type. It's called the Extreme Series. It's essentially the product type that we would be using to replace the kitchen cabinets and the equipment inside the kitchen. By way of process, the Housing Authority did solicit bids in January to rehabilitate those kitchens. We received 6 bids, and we evaluated those responses and determined that Bentley Construction Group was the lowest and responsive bidder, and their contract bid, the proposed amount, was $577,165, which is the contract that we are submitting for your consideration today. The Housing Board of Commissioners did approve the capital fund grant, the one that is subject to right now, or the fiscal year July 2019 through June 2020. It was approved on April 2nd, 2019. At that time, we did not know the complete grant amount of the capital fund, and we were anticipating it was going to be $1.5 million. But subject to that approval, the HUD appropriation turned out to be $2.2 million. As a result of which, the appropriation that we were estimating to contribute to the Palm Vista Kitchen Rehab Project increased from $250,000 to $577,000. So this is going to be completely funded out of the capital fund, which is a source explicit to the Housing Authority and does not impact the general fund. That's the presentation that I have. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I believe we have no public speakers. Mayor, any questions?
I don't have any questions. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Councilwoman Basua?
Nope, I don't have any questions.
Okay. I just actually had just one quick question. What kind of countertops are they going to be?
You mean product?
Yeah, product.
So they are included in the product series that I mentioned. Put my glasses on because I'm old. They are faux granite, fake granite.
Okay. Sounds good.
I don't know if that's the right
and
term.
with that, that's actually my one and only question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Any motion on the floor?
Motion to approve.
Second?
All right, thank you. Call for a vote.
Member Basua?
Aye.
Member Flynn?
Aye.
Chair Madrigal?
Aye.
Motion carries 3-0.
Thank you very much. Lastly, item E, items for future agendas. Committee members?
I don't want to go ahead of committee member Bastua. I'd go with her first.
Oh, well, thank you, Mayor. But
Yes.
no, I don't have anything further.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chair, one of the things I'd like to see is the city manager has launched an amazing effort at trying to bring together the needs of businesses in Oxnard with the actual training that's offered in the city. And right now with COVID-19, I think that, obviously the primary focus should be and can be how we're going to help businesses get, back on track. And that was my first request. I know it's going to be a lengthy item, and so it's not necessarily setting the expectation it'll happen in 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, we have to have all the answers for Oxnard businesses. But I think COVID-19 is particularly important. And then as a follow-up on that, maybe over the next couple of months, bringing back to the committee these extraordinary efforts that were, encouraged by me in an economic development plan, but executed and really the brainchild of it all is the city manager. So I'd like for that to be brought back to the committee on a longer term or medium term sense, but maybe in a shorter term with realistic timeframes, bringing back something that has to do with how the city is helping and positioning businesses to reopen and to survive, in addition to, as we know, the SBA loan program that we're helping businesses complete.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mayor. I have nothing for future agendas. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.